Heya, Tay here, and today we're going to be doing some parallax mapping. I'll show you how I create detailed atmospheric maps using GIMP. We're going to be working on an abandoned church hidden deep in a mysterious forest, so grab a hot beverage, maybe a snack, and let's get started. For those of you new to parallax mapping, it's a technique where we replace RPG Maker's standard tile maps with beautifully detailed layered images. This lets us add unique textures and effects that really bring our game worlds to life. Disclaimer, this isn't a for beginners type of video really. There are already some beginner-friendly parallax mapping tutorials on YouTube that talk about setting up your parallax plugin and whatnot, and I won't be doing that here. This video is going to focus on making the parallax map itself from a more design-focused standpoint, and how I use GIMP to do that. We'll talk about coming up with a map idea, making a blueprint in the editor, and then spend a long time in GIMP. I'll even go over some tips and tricks for GIMP and how to properly use it as a tool for parallax mapping, just in case you wanted to try out the software. I mean, it is free. By the end, we'll have a pretty decent map. So let's start with the map idea. This was a requested video, and I let the requester choose what kind of map I'd use for my example. They requested either forest, or maybe a church, and those ideas were fine, but a little bare bones. Plus, I don't like to do any work that isn't going to actually go to my game, and parallax mapping takes many hours to do right. So I knew I wanted to use the example map in my game somewhere, and I already have a church and plenty of forests. So that's when I had the idea to combine the forest with the church. An overgrown, dilapidated church in the middle of some deep woods? Sounds interesting. So I took to Google for inspiration on the look of the place. However, just an idea doesn't cut it. Anytime you make a map, it needs to serve a purpose in your game, especially if it's a parallax map, since you're going to spend so much time on it. Maybe the purpose is that it's an optional place for the player to visit and find some cool treasure. Or maybe it's a dungeon. Heck, maybe its purpose is just a cool cutscene. But making a map with the idea of, ooh, pretty abandoned church in a forest, won't make a game. In my game, I have these elemental deities that the party has to go around and visit certain temples to make pacts with to summon. It's all very JRPG. But I got to thinking that it would be nice if this church could be the temple for one of these elemental deities. And then I remembered that my light summon is literally named Angel, so what better place for it than a church? Especially an old abandoned church. Ooh, with a hole in the roof so rays of light can shine in and hit just the right spot of the interior to show the party where the secret door is. Write that down, write that down! We'll map the interior in a different video. So, with this backstory, this purpose for our map in mind, we can get started on actually making the darn thing. When I was on my beloved Google Images looking through pictures of churches and forests, I found this image that really spoke to me. With our top-down perspective in mind, I'll doodle a thumbnail of how I want the church to look, inspired by this image. I picture a path winding up through an overgrown forest towards a small, dilapidated chapel made of stone. It's looking just a bit dull, so I modify it to make a small stone wall around the building and even a tiny graveyard out behind it. Sketching the thumbnail is really helpful to me, but the truth is most of the vision is strictly in my head at this point. The thumbnail only gives me a small visualization of what I'm going for, and things will change throughout the map making process. So, with our thumbnail sketched and our imaginations running wild, we'll block out our base in RPG Maker. I'm using simple tiles to lay out the walls, trees, and basic layout. Think of this as creating a blueprint. None of these tiles will be what we use in the map. I'm just trying to get a sense of the scale of the place with my sprites. I want the church to feel small, but not tiny house small. Because this step is all about getting the dimensions and layout right, I go back and forth between test playing and adjusting in the map editor. It's worth mentioning that I use a map zoom plugin to zoom in my map, because I like to get closer or further away to emphasize scale. Really zoomed in small houses, only a teensy bit of zoom in castles, you get the drift. Once I'm satisfied with the layout, I'm ready to export it. I'm sure you've noticed that when you click on a map and choose the Save as Image option, the picture you get is too small. Technically, we could upscale it to the right size since we're going to completely cover it anyway, but that's just too many steps. To get our map into a usable, true-to-size image, I'm using a plugin called Orange Mapshot. I'll link both it and my Parallax plugin in the description. Now, we just open up test play mode, press the print screen button, and it saves our map as a true-to-size image file. So let's move into GIMP. My first step once I have my base map open in GIMP is to set up a grid to match my tile size. If you're using the default MV tile size and not using a plugin to change it, it'll be 48 by 48 pixels. However, I'm using a 32 by 32 pixel tile size, so that's what I'll use. In the toolbar, go to Image, then Configure Grid to set your grid size. The grid is to show us where the tiles will be in RPG Maker, and help with setting up passability later. If you're doing some kind of pixel-based movement, you can pretty much skip this step. A pro tip on the grid: Snap to Grid is a lifesaver for precision. I always have it on when I make buildings and structures. And speaking of buildings, if I have a building in my map, I almost always start by making it first. Surroundings can come later is my motto. I use some purple to block off the area where we won't be able to walk, all trees, and get started slapping some texture onto those walls. This is where I should say that tile sets are important. This stone texture is absolutely beautiful, so when used right, it's going to make our map beautiful. We can mix beautiful tiles with less beautiful tiles and still get a nice result. But it's hard, though not impossible, to make a pretty map out of only ugly tiles. Now, beauty and ugliness is like super subjective, so I'm just using what looks nice to me. I did have to end up adjusting the size of the child? Not the child! I did have to end up adjusting the size of the church once more once the map was in GIMP to get my roof to work properly, but that's not a big deal. Once our roof is made, we're going to need to do some manual adjustment. These roof tiles aren't really supposed to be used this way, so we do some copy and pasting to make it a little more cohesive, without those errors. Now for the small roof on the belfry, I'll use this already made tile as our guideline to make our own with the same texture as the rest of our roof. I'm using the perspective tool right now, and anytime you use scale, rotate, shear, perspective, or any of those tools to change your pixel art, you're going to want to make sure you have this little setting in the tool right. Interpolation should be set to none. It looks unfinished, so we'll manually draw that separation where the edges of the roof meet. When doing pixel art, if you want that hard pixel effect, use the pencil tool at 100% opacity with a size of 1 pixel. After some more finicking with light, shadow, and drawing on those edges a bit better, our little belfry roof looks done. Now, I'll use a wood texture for the walls of the belfry, just for a little variation. This is also our first use of the colorize tool, but will certainly not be the last. I think I use the colorize tool more than any other tool. It's seriously my best friend when parallax mapping, because I combine stuff from so many different packs into the same map. Colorize can help to keep your colors similar, so you're not mixing a bunch of unrelated wood tones and stuff. Our wall texture is a little bare, so I'm adding some stone detail along the edges. Yeah, that looks nice. You'll notice I'm throwing some layers into a layer group folder. I'm not very organized with my layers, but best practice would be to name each layer and sort them all into layer groups and subgroups, keeping your parallax layers, what goes above the player, and your ground layers, what goes below, into their own layer groups. Now our church is, here, but that all looks a little too new and shiny. We wanted a dilapidated church, so let's dilapidate it. Using the pencil tool again on a layer above the roof, I'll draw what's going to be a big hole. We'll add detail in a minute, but let's worry about just the base shape for now. You can use Shift when drawing to make straight lines if you're wondering. I'll use the lasso tool, with no anti-aliasing or feather on so we get crisp edges, to select some of this broken wood porch from this tile set and add it to our roof. Once we have it where we want it, I use my favorite colorize tool to make it the right color. Now let's break the wall! We already have this broken stone texture that matches our wall. Then using this broken wood and a dark background, it'll create a pretty cool effect. I cut out a part where I was trying to make a cool foundation, but it just looked super ugly and I ended up changing it later anyway, so know that mapping doesn't always go the way you want it, and let's move on to windows. These windows look nice and churchy, but plain, so I drew some broken panes of glass. So I drew some broken panes of glass in them using the pencil tool again. By the way, if you want to change all of a color into something else, you can use this Select by Color tool, and just use the pencil in a big size to color over it once it's selected. With the windows done, I move on to the door. I take a lot of extra steps to make this door look not very good, so I'll just speed through this part. Next is that small stone fence we mentioned. I found this interesting cliff tile, and I think we can do some copy pasting and modifying on it to make a really nice wall. As I build our little wall, I try to line it up with the grid, keeping in mind what's going to be above and behind the player, and what's going to be passable. I'd like to be able to walk sort of behind the wall. I'm copying and pasting parts of the wall, and I'm going in with my pencil tool to make things a little more natural and less copy-pasta looking. Once I'm pretty happy with my wall, we can get some basic ground texture to set the tone of the green we're going to want to use for our forest. I really love the look of this dirt, so I'd like to use it for a dirt path, but I really don't like the busyness of the grass. So I'll just steal the color from it for now, and start the tedious job of building the path tiny tile by tiny tile. Be right back. Okay, we've got our path. Now we can get started on the forest part of this church in a forest. While I'm working on adding trees to this forest, let's talk about a key principle of map design: designing with gameplay in mind. When you're making art, you can just focus on making the piece visually appealing. I find when you search Parallax Map RPG Maker on Google Images that you see a lot of maps that are like art and not really like maps to a game. The thing is, games are meant to be played, and when you just make everything pretty without thinking about the player who is playing the game, you can get a little lost in your map design. So let's focus on guiding the player and using visual cues to create a natural flow through the map. When you're designing any kind of map, whether it's a forest like this, a town, or even an evil wizard tower of doom, it's important to think about how players will move through the space. You want the path forward to feel intuitive. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a straight line. In fact, twists and turns make maps more interesting, but it does mean you should subtly guide the player with the design itself. For example, on this map, the path leading to the church is open and easy to read. Spoiler for a second for the finished map. Notice how there aren't a lot of obstructions. The player sees it and naturally thinks, this is where I'm supposed to go. Now compare that to the forested areas around the path. I'm using what's called visual noise to create a clear contrast. All of those details from the different trees overlapping creates a barrier. That extra visual complexity signals to the player you can't walk here. It's an intuitive way to keep them on track while still adding depth to the environment. And that's the trick. You don't want your players wandering aimlessly because they're unsure of what's part of the map and what's just decoration. Funny story, back whenever I was first learning to play video games, and I mean that in the literal sense, I didn't grow up with video games. I was introduced to video games by my best friend back in high school, and the first game that I ever played was Final Fantasy VI. And at the very beginning of the game, you enter the mines in Narsh, and I didn't know anything about video games. I didn't really understand top-down perspective. I had no idea what I was looking at, and so whenever I got to the part where the ceiling kind of covered, where you can walk a little bit, I was so confused. I didn't know that I could walk underneath that. I was stood there as Terra in the Magitech armor for ages until my friend finally looked at me and was like, "Hey, what are you doing? Just walk forward." Thankfully, I won't really have to worry about that with my players because nobody's going to seek out a retro-style indie RPG and it be their first RPG. Anyway, visual noise serves a dual purpose in our map. First, it acts as a boundary, helping the player distinguish what's passable from what isn't. But second, it's also a tool for storytelling. The overgrown look reinforces the vibe I'm going for, this abandoned church deep in the woods, untouched for who knows how long. Even though the player can't explore those areas, they still contribute to the overall atmosphere of the map. Now back to the path. Keeping it clear doesn't mean it should be boring. I like to sprinkle in small details like patches of mushrooms and some overlapping grass textures to make it feel lived in and connected to the world. But the key is to avoid overloading it with too much detail. If every part of the map has the same level of texture and complexity, players might feel overwhelmed or even confused about what exactly they're looking at. On the flip side, if everything is too simple or empty, the world feels flat and lifeless. Your goal as a designer is to keep players immersed, not just in the story, but in the world itself. And that's really the heart of map design, finding that sweet spot between beauty and functionality. Now, back to our map. You can see that I've been adjusting hue, saturation, and contrast levels on trees as I bring them into the scene, to make them all work together well. I've also mixed and matched trunks with leaves and all sorts of Frankenstein stuff with the tiles. It'll all look fine in the end. I also wanted to emphasize that claustrophobic feeling just a bit, so I added those big, tree barrier things. I don't know what to call them. The tree things that fade into black that they used in Final Fantasy V or something. I also added a little elevation. That's just more of that visual noise, to be honest. It doesn't do anything, just adds another layer of visual interest and tells the player you can't walk here, don't even try it, bub. Something that I really like to do in maps is layering these ground textures. I added a ton of little grass textures. I'm not gonna lie, this is super tedious, but also kind of relaxing. I like to put on a podcast when I'm placing grass. Speaking of tedious, we're gonna go in with our 1 pixel pencil brush again and draw some mossy green stuff on our wall and such. It'll help with that overgrown, taken by nature look. I'll eventually draw this mossy stuff, like, everywhere. But now we've reached my favorite part of mapping, the decorations! Decoration time! I do love decorating. What was that? For this map, I'm thinking rocks, flowers, and mushrooms, for that foresty aesthetic. These window boxes are super cute, and let's cover that roof in vines. Don't worry about the color for now. I'll use my beloved colorize tool to fix it. I decided I didn't care for the viney look exactly, so I'm going in with that eraser and erasing the vine bits, leaving the leaves. By the way, about the eraser, if you want that pixel effect for your eraser as well, scroll down and select Hard Edge. Otherwise, if you want it to be fluffy and like a normal eraser, don't select Hard Edge. While placing rocks, I realized that I'd rather the stone wall look a little bit more like the same stone I used for the stairs leading into the church, so colorize tool again. Finally, when all our decorative details are added and we're happy with it, it's time to shadow. For this foresty map, I want to add some shadows beneath the tree leafy parts on the parallax layer. Then, for the kind of lighting that shows important parts of the map, I'll put that on the actual shadow layer. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the idea is that I leave important or interactable things brighter, but add shadow to the less important things. This is another way that game making is different from art, because oftentimes this type of shadow and light doesn't make a lot of sense if we're thinking about realistic shadows, but it does make logical sense to players. Some people may disagree with the use of this kind of shadowing, and in fact, I've had people call out my shadows for being unrealistic. I personally think that unrealistic doesn't necessarily equal bad, but with our shadows done, our map is pretty much finished. So let's export our different layers and load them into RPG Maker. I always recommend saving the editable file with layers intact too, in case you want to tweak something later. Let's do a quick walk around to make sure everything looks and feels right. It's so satisfying to see it all come together. My sunlight's from a plugin, and I added a few events, though there's definitely room to add a bit more life into the place. I'll probably end up adding some animated doodads before long. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this map turned out. I love the little mushrooms, and the graveyard's cute too. I'm also pleased with the big hole in the roof. The wonderful thing about parallax mapping that makes it different from mapping in the editor is that it allows you to experiment and really do your own thing. You can mix and match tiles and draw in your own details to suit your vision. Parallax mapping lets you bring out your creativity and make maps that feel personal and unique with no cookie-cutter layouts. I encourage anyone watching this to really break free from the mold of what a map is supposed to look like or what other people's maps look like. Just feel free to make maps your way. It's your game after all. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, consider buying this poor game developer a cup of coffee. Thank you to the people who have, by the way. That is so amazing. I couldn't believe it whenever I saw donations actually come in. Of course, if not, that's totally okay too. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, and I'll see you in the next video! Will you try parallax mapping for your game? Did you learn any tips from this video? Gonna download GIMP? Let me know in the comments. Speaking of the comments, if you have any requests or ideas for videos, let me know and I'll try to make them for you. Okay, I've rambled enough. Thanks again, and bye-bye!